Met Shlomo, we talked about, one of the things we talked about was Rumi, and he said that I was very, very taken in by his poetry when I met it 25 years ago. And I bought a book called The Essential Rumi, which now I have in my computer here. And I didn't know how good it was in Farsi or not. I have no idea, because I can't read a single word. But I understand that a lot of the beauty is gone if you read it in English, but that's as good as I can get to. And I was impressed by the content, less so by the poetry, but as good as translations are. So we talked about this a little bit, and I think that was one of the reasons that we actually hit it off, because I think Shlomo told me he never met a rabbi who had read Rumi and was interested in it. And so I'm interested like a layman. I don't know anything about Rumi, right? Before this class, I read 2 books in order to like at least know something. But this is definitely not my area of expertise. And then certainly because of the language barrier, there's a lot missing. But I'll try to say some of the things that I learned from him, and try to connect it to my world, to the world of Jewish mysticism. And try to understand the parallels and some of the differences. Not as a comparison, but just to try to deepen the appreciation for what he did. So, first of all, he was born in, they say 1207 is the year. That was a long time ago. I think almost 820 years now. And he was born in I guess a northern part of Iran today, whatever it's called. But he ended up spending most of his life in Turkey, and he was called, the Americans or the Europeans call him Rumi because that's basically Roman. It's an abbreviation of Roman, because that was the end of the Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire was all the way to Turkey, and he was at the very edge of it. And his languages were apparently Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. Those were the 3 languages that he knew. He started out as a regular, I don't know if he was an imam in the regular sense, but he was like a jurist. He ruled on different things in Sharia. But then he met someone called Shams, and this man changed his life entirely, and he became a mystic. He always had a leaning, but something changed in him. He was about 35 when he met him, and we'll get to that relationship. There's something very special about the relationship, and a lot to say about it in a Jewish context. And then he began to look at the world from a much more, let's call it, universal sense, which most mystics have. They have a much wider view of religion and of their practices. And he definitely went and he, at some point, Shams disappeared. Disappeared once, and he found him again, and then he disappeared a second time, and he never found him again. But that led to a transformation in him. And the transformation was that he realized that it wasn't the person Shams that he needed, it was what Shams had awakened inside of him. And so from that moment on, he called his inspiration that was flowing from him, he said that he's Shams. He's become Shams. And so that was a very, very important revelation for him. And then he wrote a tremendous amount of poetry, the Masnavi, which is the most famous one probably, the one that I read, and then a collection, many singular poems about different topics. And if I had to say, we'll get to poems in a moment, but if I had to say what strikes me the most about his style and his content is that he's not just interested in, let's call it, he's not just interested in the spiritual world. He's very, very interested in the physical world. And he knows he studies everything. He studies everything there is to study. And he looks at it. And what he does with it is he elevates it. He takes even very coarse, even sometimes you would say, not modest things. And he extracts from them what can you learn spiritually about your spiritual life from something like this. So some of these things I can't read because you have to read it for yourself. I can't repeat it out loud. But they're very powerful. Anyway, so the first one I want to start with is they titled it, I don't know if the titles here are in the original Farsi or whether they just gave the titles. And it's called An Awkward Comparison. And I think, and we can start off with this thing because it's exactly what I just said about his attention to detail of the material world. He says like this physical world has no two things alike. Every comparison is awkwardly rough. You can put a lion next to a man, but the placing is hazardous to both. He's also very cunning. Like everything that he does is like, there's a twist of it. Say the body is like this lamp. It has to have a wick and oil, sleep and food, right? That's how they're the same. If it doesn't get those, it will die. And it's always burning those up, trying to die. But where is the sun in this comparison? It rises, and the lamp's light mixes with the day. Oneness, which is the reality, cannot be understood with lamp and sun images. The blurring of a plural into a unity is wrong. No image can describe what of our fathers and mothers, our grandfathers and grandmothers remains. Language does not touch the one who lives in each of us. So there's many, many levels on this poem. I want to start with the first statement that he says. That no two things in this, that it's a dangerous thing to compare two things in the physical world. Every comparison is awkwardly rough. Why in the physical world? Like you would think that the physical world is crude and it's not exact. So what do you care that two things are not exactly alike? But what he's saying is a very important principle in Jewish mysticism also. Same thing. That actually the variety of the physical world is in a certain sense greater than the variety of the spiritual world. That when things come down from the spiritual into the physical, they actually divide and become defined in ways that the spiritual can't even handle. There's nothing like that. In fact, when we abstract out what we do, when we say, it says, you put the lamp and the person together, and this is a very important comparison in the Zohar and the Tanya. The soul is compared, or the person himself is compared to a lamp in chapter 35 and on of the Tanya. Yet they're so completely different. And you can only see that in the physical world. In fact, we would say that the reason that the soul even comes down into this world is in order to appreciate the multiplicity of Hashem's faces, of how many different ways Hashem can appear, how many different ways every spiritual idea can be represented, and each one is something different. So if we take this for a moment and we expand this a little bit more, this is what happens in every discussion in the Talmud. We take a verse, and the verse is something very defined, and then we begin to discuss it, and many, many different opinions, many different faces appear out of that one. When? Not when you discuss in the abstract, but rather when you try to apply it. And when you begin to apply it, you say, oh, but this is a special case, and this is a special case, and this is a special case. And you begin to have all special cases to the point where you begin to understand that even though everyone in this room is a Jew, and everyone in this room shares the same soul, but we're completely different. That somehow this oneness is somehow expressed in an infinite variety that is different. And as much as we're the same, we're completely different. And that is the premise of true mysticism. That you don't look for the fulfillment of your journey in abstracting yourself out of reality, but rather you look for it by coming back into reality. Meaning, if you have achieved some level of spirituality, it's measured, its value is measured, whether you can bring it back down into reality and use it in this reality here and see the differences. So the first thing is appreciation of the differences between things. I'm going throughout this, let's call it a shira in some sense. I'm going to tell you about my Rumi. Who's my Rumi? My Rumi is Rabbi Steinsaltz, who passed away 2.5 years ago. And the reason I say that he's my Rumi is because when I met him at first, I had already read Rumi, and suddenly I met a person who spoke the same way. He wasn't as good with verse. He wasn't a poet. He was prose and a very, very concise and exact writer. But his style was exactly the same way. He would look at things in the world and extract the spiritual lesson from them. And he had an infinite number of stories to tell. Not infinite, because I heard a lot of them more than once. But other people heard things that I didn't hear. And after he passed away, we started collecting all the different stories, and we have thousands of them now. All the different examples that he used to give to people on how to understand the world that we're in and how to extract from the physical world something. So one of the stories is that he used to love telling us that he had a student who was very, very spiritual. And he was so spiritual that he was constantly studying Kabbalah and Chassidut. And then one day, as it happens to many people, he was going to get married. So the custom by Chassidim is that there's a chassan tish before the wedding, meaning that all the men get together, and they have a table. They open the table with the chassan, with the groom, and they're singing and speaking and so on. And at the same time, supposedly, the bride is supposed to be on her side of the hall, and she's seeing people. Like they come up to her throne, sort of like that's how it's made, like a throne made out of flowers. And so this young man, he's sitting there, and there's no bride. She's late, and she's later and later and later. So finally, Rav Shtanzel says to him, "So I understand that you thought until now that you were going to marry the Shekhinah, the divine presence. You thought you were going to marry the Sfirah of Malchut. You thought you were going to marry some abstract concept of a woman. Well, now I have news for you. You're going to marry an actual person, and actual people are late. And your task is to put a smile on, and no matter what happens, to show that you're happy. That's your job. And not to worry about the fact that she's late." And that was one of the stories that he gave us to emphasize that you can't live in a spiritual world. You have to have spiritual goals. You have to have spirit as something that helps you. But in the end, you have to live in the physical world. And the physical world is populated by actual people and actual objects and actual things that happen. And there you have to know how to act. So this is a beautiful example of this, that the physical world is always, in the end, more complex than the spiritual world. Now, granted that there is the opposite opinion in the Zohar, I don't want to talk about it right now, but this is, because obviously anything you can say one direction, you can also say in the other direction, but we're going to follow this one right now. Okay, so that's the first poem I wanted to start with by Rumi. I want to talk a little bit about his relationship with Shams. It's, like we said before, everything in his life changed when he met him. And he touched him in such a way, and then he began to speak. It was very interesting. And I think it's not fully understood by the people that read this, from outside the spiritual or mystical world. He began to speak about love. It's a very important thing. He was married before. He actually was married twice, and he had, I think, 4 children already. But he didn't write or speak about love until he met Shams. And that's a very disturbing thing, especially for women, right? Because why would your husband not talk about love when he's married to you, and only when he meets someone who's a spiritual guide, he suddenly begins to speak about love? So the simple reason is because men don't know how to love. And they need to be opened up by someone who reveals the spiritual world to them, the mystical world to them, for them to be able to begin to express emotion. It's very difficult for men to express emotion. There's a lot of reasons not to express emotion. It's very vulnerable. It's not manly. It's not this. It's not that. And sometimes you need to see an example of someone who is able to do this, and then you begin to speak about it. So it wasn't necessarily just his love for Shams. It was the opening up of the whole emotional world, which until then was closed. In my case, I remember that the person who did this for me was a teacher that I had. His name was Rabbi Fruman, and he was the first person that I saw that was able to actually express his deep emotions for people. He was a little crazy already, but I guess they're all like that. The people that open you up in this sense, they're almost like something from a different world. And you saw this in every relationship that he had. You felt an outpouring of emotion. And so you also feel an outpouring of emotion towards God. It's the same thing. And suddenly there's a deep connection that is formed, and this is exactly what I think Rumi experienced, that everything that before then was like jurisprudence, is what we call it, was legal. You have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, became, I love this, and I love God, and I want to be with Him. That was the churn inside of him, from being something that was totally technical and seeing religion as something that's technical into something that's emotional. And when that happens, life has changed. But this always happens with a teacher. We don't know of any example of this happening just by itself. How does it suddenly happen by itself? There's always somebody who teaches you. There's always someone in the background. Sometimes they're better known, sometimes they're not so well known. But there's always someone in the background. This leads to a very important thing. First of all, I'll tell a little story, also from Rabbi Steinsaltz. He says, we all have friends that we don't so much want to see. If they come over, we try to get rid of them. So how do you get rid, he says, of a friend like this that you don't really want to spend time with? So you say to them something like, I don't have time so much now. When I'll have time, I'll come over. I'll come say, don't call me, right? Don't call us, we'll call you. That's the thinking. He used to tell us all the time, don't be like one of those Jews that says this to God. When I have time, I'll come visit you. But don't come calling on me. I'm not interested. He says, that change that occurs when you begin to understand that this is not a friend that you have duties towards. So you have to come. You have to. That's the change when your heart begins to open. And you begin to feel that this is not a world of obligation. That also exists. There's a world of obligation. But when you come alive, it's because something in your heart is moved. And it's always because of some spiritual teacher. Somebody who captures you and almost like it's like a virus. You catch it and you suddenly feel it. And he says, there's something else. There's something I've been missing. And all your relationships change. But predominantly the first one is the one with God. Rumi has a whole series of poems about King Solomon. So we won't get to it right now at the moment. I just want to say something about King Solomon. King Solomon tried to capture his feelings towards God in a long poem that he wrote, which is called the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. What's the premise? The premise is that the way to describe feelings that I have towards God is like feelings between a man and a woman. And so that's how he builds it. That there is this beloved and his beloved woman, and they're constantly, it's not so clear when you read Shir HaShirim what it's about. Why are they having such a difficult time getting together? But the reason they're having such a difficult time getting together is because, strangely enough, she's married. She's a married woman. That's what he wrote it about. He wrote about someone who loves a married woman. How could that be a description of anything good? The answer is that our soul is married to the body. That's really what it's about. I'm already committed somewhere. So the soul comes and says, I have to live my physical life. What can I do? I have to make my living, and I have all these commitments, and I have to eat, and I have to sleep, and I have to do this, and I have to do that. I'm married to it. And yet I have a beloved that I'm yearning for. And so that's the tension that he built the whole song around. So that was in the time of King Solomon, 3,000 years ago. But, the world has moved forward since then. And in Chassidus, in the Chassidic thought, it was said that if King Solomon would have known about the relationship between a Rebbe and a Chassid, he wouldn't have written the Song of Songs about a man and a woman. He would have written it about a man and a Chassid. Now, a Rebbe and his disciple, because that love is even more complete than the love between a man and a woman. And if you come on Thursday, we'll talk about that a lot more at CPY, about why that is. But it's a basic idea that men and women have a sense of love, but it's more like companionship. It's much more based on companionship than on pure love. And yet, between a teacher and a student, there's also one who's giving and one who's receiving. There's an insemination going on. And there's birth going on. Meaning that after you're given from your teacher, then eventually you give birth to something. Your life changes. Rabbi Nachman used to say that the world says you can't get pregnant from stories. He says, from my stories you can definitely get pregnant. What he meant was that the fact that people talk about each other, she was with him, nobody ever got pregnant from that. He says, from my stories, if you read my stories, you'll get pregnant. Because that's the power of this type of relationship of a teacher and a student, which is deeper in many senses and more complete than the relationship between a man and a woman. And so here we have this same idea with Rumi, that what awakened him was his relationship to Shams, and from then on he began to speak about love in everything, because the moment that the emotions awakened, it became possible to see love everywhere. He wasn't able to express it, he wasn't able to be vulnerable enough to say it. And now he was, after he met Shams. I told you that that my Rumi was Rav Steinsaltz. So I'll give you an example of one of his stories. In certain situations, he would repeat this. He said that one of the students, one of the disciples of the Rebbe of Kotsk, was a very famous Rebbe, Menachem Mendel of Kotsk. He was well known for his truth, his authenticity. In fact, today there's a whole movement in the Jewish academic world and in the neo-Hasidic world to connect to the Kotzker because of his authenticity. That you can't, he had this famous saying, that if I am I because you are you, then I am not I and you are not you. In other words, if I'm being me because of your pressure, then I'm not me and you're not you. We each have to be authentic to ourselves. In any case, so the Kotzker once had one of his disciples come to him and ask him, why don't you write a book? You have so many deep things that you teach us. So isn't it worthwhile that other people should read it? And this would happen to be someone who did not hear the Kotzker a lot. He heard him here and there. He was there. So the Kotzker says, I imagine that you want a book for yourself because you want to hear all the things that you've been missing. So I'll explain to you why I don't write a book. Because if the book is for you, for instance, so you work all week and you don't have time during the middle of the week. When you come home, you're too tired to read the book, right? So when's the only time that you have time? Shabbat, after you eat the morning meal, then you say, oh, now I have a few hours until mincha. So you'll take the book and you'll lie with it on your couch and you'll say, I'll read it. And the only thing that will happen is that you'll fall asleep with the book open. He says, and I have no interest of sleeping with you. He said that in order to, because it's such a common thing, we all know exactly what this is. And on the face of it, it's just, just us being tired and nothing. But it gives suddenly a sense of that the person who wrote the book invested himself in it. You suddenly feel that maybe it demands more than just holding it open and falling asleep with it. Maybe there's somebody there. There's also same thing, same idea that you can't be with someone and fall asleep on them, because where's the connection? What's going on? And so this was a story that he repeated many times in order to impress that on us. The goal of religion, the goal of connection to God, the goal certainly of mysticism, is not to accumulate knowledge. It's a very important thing. A lot of people think, rightfully so, because there is such an element that to be let's call it a committed Jew, you have to learn a lot. And so somebody says, what is my goal? What is my success? So he says, okay, I want this year to finish these and these books. I'm going to finish all these books that I have here on my list. And it's true, you need to. But that doesn't really capture what it means to be committed. Why? Because, and I'll read to you from his poem about this. He calls it 2 kinds of intelligence. He writes, there are 2 kinds of intelligence. One, acquired. As a child in school memorizes facts and concepts from books and from what the teacher says, collecting information from the traditional sciences as well as from the new sciences. With such intelligence, you rise in the world. You get ranked ahead or behind others in regard to your competence in retaining information. You stroll with this intelligence in and out of fields of knowledge, getting always more marks on your preserving tablets. But there is another kind of tablet. Right away when he said this, I thought of the two tablets of the covenant. That one of them is about, we can call it my commitment to God. The other one is about my behavior. So my behavior is like the cumulative side. My commitment to God is something entirely different. And so he says like this. There is another kind of tablet. One already completed and preserved inside you. You don't have anything to add to it. There's no addition needed. No study needed. A spring overflowing its spring box. A freshness in the center of the chest. This other intelligence does not churn yellow or stagnate. It's fluid, and it doesn't move from outside to inside through the conduits of plumbing, learning. This second knowing is a fountainhead from within you moving out. That is the true unlocking of the Spirit. When you begin to feel that you could write the books. Now, obviously, maybe you can't write everything because this is an accumulation of 3,500 years of people who had this fountainhead, who had this ability. But that needs to be the goal of religion. The religion is not just to follow something because of its correctness, and not just to shape myself behaviorally, but rather to ask the question of, can I write something new? Do I have a fountain inside of me? Or as we call it, an infinite flow of new ideas, an infinite flow of new emotion, and an ability to express it. That is really the goal. He once said this very beautifully. He said that the religion that we practice is like the beginning of the road. It's just like to get you onto the path. But then the real work that you do is then following this wherever it takes you. You have to use religion in such a way that it unlocks something inside of you. It has to bring out something inside of you. Now, going back to my Rumi, to Rav Steinsaltz, somebody once asked him, is the I that I feel my soul? Right? We all feel ourselves. Is that my soul? So he answered like this. He said, every person is like a many-floored building. And you can live anywhere you want in this building, any floor that you choose. He says, a lot of people, or maybe most people, choose to live in the basement. That's where their I is. That's where they feel themselves. In the basement. And they never go up to explore whether there are higher floors in themselves. It says, the soul is all these floors. It's all of them. It's from the top all the way to the bottom, all the way to the basement. And you have to decide where in this building you want to live. He says that's this idea that when you open it up, when something is actually opened up, then you suddenly possess a freedom to choose where you want to live inside of yourself. Where do you want this fountain to come out of? Because everybody has a fountain in a certain sense. Even the people living in the basement. You can't say that they're not in the building. They're there. but it's it's the ground floor. It's the basement. They have so many higher levels that they could choose to live at. And then that same fountain, and by the way, this is true about relationships also. Every relationship can be, a ground level relationship, or a basement, maybe even worse than that. And then it can go all the way to the height of the tower. It all depends on where you choose. In that sense, the Torah tells us all the time that you should choose life. To choose life is to choose to live on the higher floors. Always looking for something that's more alive, that's more expressive, that's more emotional, that has more life force in it. And that you don't succumb, especially the older you get, the less strength you have. I have to tell you about this, another story that he used to tell us a lot. He says when he was a child, there was a Breslev Chassid who was 95 years old, living near him. And every morning, early in the morning, he could hardly walk, but every morning he made his way to the mikveh to immerse before going to daven, before going to shacharit. And so Rav Steinzl says, when I began to learn something, he came from a completely non-religious family, in fact a communist family, there was absolutely no religion there. So when he began to study something, and he knew, so he came to this neighbor of his, this 95-year-old, and he says to him, why do you work so hard? Why do you strain yourself so much every single morning to go to the mikveh? It's so hard for you, and then going to the mikveh every morning is it's not a halacha, it's not anything like that, it's not required. It's a big extra. So he says, this man told him, as long as you're alive, you have to live. As long as you're alive, you have to live. You have to keep living, which is sometimes the hardest thing to do, because you're tired already. Or you're used to not living. You're used to being in the bottom floor. When Rav Steinzl himself had a stroke 5 years before he passed away, and from the moment that he had the stroke, he changed because he couldn't speak. And a big part of his life was speaking. All the time, he was speaking constantly. And suddenly he couldn't speak. He could get a few words out, and you would have to listen very carefully to understand what he was saying. So one of the guys, so we knew that this pained him terribly. He continued to work. He was able to type still, and he continued to work, and he finished his commentary on the entire Bible at that time, and most of his commentary on the Mishnah. He did a lot of work in the last 5 years. He had this thing that every year on his birthday he would complete the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud over the year, and he would celebrate on his birthday. That was like his celebration. The last year of his life, one of the guys went to see him a little bit before his birthday, and he tried to speak to him, trying to engage him and bring him some joy and this and that. And he came with his son because he loved children. So he paid a little bit of attention to the son, but then he completely ignored our friend. And he was with the Talmud in his hand. He was just reading, and he didn't look up. And so this guy who came, he thought, he's busy now, he'll probably finish in 10, 20 minutes. So in the meantime, he talked to his wife. After 10, 20 minutes, he says, don't wait for him. Why? Because his birthday is coming up, and he's far from finishing. So now he's under pressure to finish both Talmuds. That's all he does now. He just reads and reads and reads. He knew it pretty much by heart. And then he came after his birthday, and suddenly everything was completely different. And now he was receptive, and he couldn't talk, but he was receptive, and he was with him. And this was 2 weeks before he passed away. He passed away 2 weeks after his birthday, and actually even less. Sorry, like a week after his birthday. So this was the last time he saw him, and he said he saw exactly what he had been telling us for years, that as long as you're alive, you have to live. There was tremendous intensity in everything that he did. It was all very difficult, but everything he was. How did he know that he was still intense? He was reading Ken Follett. Anybody ever read him? He's like a spy novelist or something. So he was reading this, and he looked up and it says, I don't remember what he says. Something like that. He still had to know everything that was going on. I said that Rumi is not adverse to using anything in this world. Everything is something. Everything has a lesson from it. This is what we call in Hebrew musar. Musar is usually translated as ethics. But it's not exactly ethics. It's more like to learn the proper way to conduct myself from things that I see. That's musar. And so here's a poem about that. I'm going to cut it short because it goes on to other things I don't want to repeat, but you can imagine. A certain man had a jealous wife and a very, very appealing maidservant. The wife was careful not to leave them alone, ever. For 6 years they were never left in a room together. If they had yichud, like in Torah, they wouldn't have a problem. But then one day, yichud means that you can't be with a woman that you're not married to, alone in a place. But then one day at the public bath, the wife suddenly remembered that she'd left her silver wash basin at home. Please go get the basin, she told her maid. The girl jumped to the task because she knew that she would finally get to be alone with the master. She ran joyfully. She flew. And desire took them both so quickly that they didn't even latch the door. Meanwhile, the wife back at the bathhouse, washing her hair, realized, what have I done? I've set the cotton wool on fire. I put the ram in with the ewe. She washed the clay soap off her hair and ran, fixing her chador about her as she went. The maid ran for love. The wife ran out of fear and jealousy. There is a great difference. The mystic flies moment to moment. The fearful ascetic drags along month to month. It's part of the poem, not everything. That they're both running. But how different is the running? How much the reason for running changes the whole meaning of it. And again, this is like something that's very, very crude. It goes on. It's not. I didn't read half of it. But even to think about something like that, there was in Chabad, there's a tradition that there are certain mashpi'im. Mashpi'im are people who are basically like Rumi. They give you musar. They tell you about proper conduct from different stories. And there's a tradition in Chabad that in every generation there is one who has no limits on what he says. He can say anything. And when I was growing up, his name was Dunin. He was from Haifa, and he was very, very close to the Rebbe. He was actually one of the few people that could walk into the Lubavitcher Rebbe any time he wanted to, like literally, like knock on the door and walk in. And from him we know a lot of very intimate details about the Rebbe's thought, and I don't know how to say this in English. I'm going to make mistakes. But in Hebrew it's amazing. It's one of the most, but I'll give you an example of it. So Dunin was a tractor driver. That's what he did for his livelihood. He wasn't like a rabbi, not even close. He was like a very simple man. But everything that he looked at, for him was a lesson, was something about how proper conduct. So he had this story that he loved telling us that he says when I was young, I lived on a kibbutz, and we had a. See, now I don't remember the words in English. What do you call the place where the cows live? A barn. I guess a barn. Let's call it a barn. In Hebrew, it's a refit. I don't remember what it's called in there, where you keep the cows. Anyway, so it's a barn. Let's call it a barn. It says in the barn, on the top of the barn, there's always birds' nests, because birds always get in there, and there's a very good place for them because it's very high. So he says this nest had 5-6 chicks in it, and as it happens from time to time, one of the chicks fell out. So where does he land? He lands on what cows do all day long. It's all full of their filth. So he lands on it, and thankfully, even though he thinks he's going to die because he can't flap his wings yet, but suddenly the S word, right? In the poo of the cow. Oh, so it stopped his fall. It's not so bad. But then, after a little while, he gets cold because he's not in the nest. And he doesn't have feathers yet. And he begins to feel cold, and he's going to die from a cold. And one of the cows walks near him, and poos on him. And suddenly he's very happy because it's nice and warm. But then, there's cats in Israel especially. So the cat walks into the barn, and it's looking for something to organize there and sort it out. And it smells underneath. It smells that there's a chick. So it comes close and it starts looking, and he sees, yeah, it is. But you can't eat a chick who's like that. So he starts licking him to clean him off, and then he eats him. So what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is that not everybody who poos on you is against you, and not everybody who's willing to lick you is for you. You say right there. And you have to learn, I have to say it in Hebrew because some people will understand. לא כל מי שמחרבן עליך שונא אותך, ולא כל מי שמוכן ללקק לך אוהב אותך. That's how Dunin used to say it. I'm saying it in his words. It's been published, and I'm not saying anything. But this is exactly, there's this side of Rumi that he's exactly like this. He'll look at everything, and everything is a lesson. Everything is something that you can take musar, you can take a moral from. You can understand how to live life better. You can see that's the meaning of a true mystic. Because a true mystic, like we started out, he doesn't just go in the direction of how do I abstract myself out of existence. He's thinking all the time, how is this world, the many faces, the many appearances of divine wisdom, of divine thought, of everything that makes life worthwhile. There is a danger. There's a danger in this style. What's the danger? The danger is that this is what we call, so first of all, what is he doing? What is he doing? He's doing what we call elevating the sparks. All of elevating the sparks really means that we look at the world and we uncover something holy within it. Something that has meaning, something that is more than just the cow and the barn and the poo and the chick and the cat. There's something going on. This very uncomfortable situation where two women are running towards one man. But like the idea here is, why are you running towards God? Are you running out of fear? Or are you running out of love? This is called elevating the sparks. The problem is that elevating the sparks in the way that he does it is always questionable. Why is it questionable? Because you have to unravel the meaning. It's not so easy all the time. We could argue a lot about what does he actually want to say. What does it mean that the ascetic is running out of fear? What exactly does that mean? What does it mean that someone else is running out of love, but it's forbidden love? So how do you exactly justify it? Like, what's going on here? this is the problem with what he did, and I, again, not to criticize, but to understand what the issue is. Especially in our generation, there's two ways in which people communicate. Let's call it communicate. The one is prose. And by prose I mean that I write out exactly what I mean and use very clear language, no similes, no metaphors. If I use a metaphor, it's only to make it easier to read, meaning that keep you interested. But everything that I want to say to you, I say it exactly the way it is. This is called exact writing. One of the things I noticed right away when I first met Rav Ginsburg was that he never uses metaphors. Never. He'll never say something is like something else. He'll say exactly what he means. Why? Because there's no room for mistakes. There's no room to misunderstand. I mean, you may not understand, but you won't misunderstand. You may feel that it is too difficult to understand, but you won't misunderstand. You'll face the fact that you don't understand what he's saying. The other style is to speak in poetry. And there's many forms of poetry. It could be that you actually make it in rhyme, or you don't make it rhyme. That's really not what's important. The point of poetry is that you use metaphors, that you use analogies, that you use similes, use all these instruments of language to make it more interesting, to make it more theatrical. Right? There's any good speaker that you ever hear has to put on a show. There's very few speakers that have more than, let's say, 5,000 views on YouTube who don't put on a show. It's very uncommon. Because people want to be entertained. And so you're entertaining them. Rumi started out as someone who was a legal judge. There was no room for poetry in what he did. But then he changed his style when he became like someone who was preaching. As a preacher, he had to get people's attention. And to get people's attention, he started using poetry. And actually, that's probably how most of these things were originally written. He tried them out on his audience, and he saw how they reacted. So what can happen? So this is called, it's a very interesting, it's a whole topic in Kabbalah and in the Torah itself. When Jacob was fleeing from Esau, after he came back from Haran, from Laban, and he met Esau's angel, and then he moves just before that, he moved his whole family across the river. And the reason that he met Esau's angel was because he went back to pick up small vessels, it says, pachim ktanim. Why is this even important? Why does the Torah tell us something like this? Okay, he met up with Esau's angel and he fought him, and then he received the name Israel. So the interesting thing is, first of all, we'll do the gematria and then start looking at it a little bit more deeply. Jacob plus small vessels equals Israel. Meaning Yaakov plus pachim ktanim equals Israel. It's like he received the name Israel, the higher name that he had. First he was called just Jacob, then he became Israel, because he went after these small vessels. These small vessels, in Gematria, they're equal to Satan. It's also because it means that Yaakov plus Satan equals Israel. What's going on here? What is this? So in Kabbalah it's explained like this. Meeting up with Esau's angel and going after these small vessels was actually two different ways to describe the same thing. Obviously they're different, but in principle they're the same thing. What are small vessels? Prose is a wide vessel. Poetry is a small vessel. Why? Because small vessels contain small amounts of light, meaning, in other words, that there's too much room for interpretation. And they can break because of that. They're even called the vessels of the world of chaos. They're chaotic, because you don't know what'll come out. One person will understand it this way, one person will understand it that way, some people won't get it at all. And there's a lot of theatrics in it. But that itself, as weak as that is, that's what's needed to make Jacob into Israel. Yeah, this is a very important and surprising point that's discussed in length in Chassidut. You would think that we don't need theatrics, we don't need poetry. We should be very clear and concise and exact and write clear prose. But these small vessels that are prone to breaking and to being misunderstood are exactly what's needed to turn Jacob into Israel. How do we explain this in this generation? This generation doesn't have an attention span. They're only about small vessels. When you say you don't have an attention span, it's not exactly true. They want to be entertained all the time. If you're entertaining me, I don't mind watching for 8 hours straight. I can play a video game for 8 hours straight, no problem. Don't need to eat, don't have completely concentrated. Why? Because it's all small vessels. There's nothing clear about it. It's all a representation of something. It's entertainment. So the inclination that we might have is we don't need that. That's unnecessary. We don't need to make videos on TikTok. Because what's the point? They don't have an effect anyway. But the Rebbe talked about this a lot, and this is one of the great changes in our generation, that even though these things are very small and prone to break and prone to not hold anything, it's the only way that you can take Jacob, who is the lower appearance of Judaism, which is not affecting the world and not reaching out, and how you change it into something that becomes Israel, which becomes something that is able to cope with everything. You have to take these small vessels also. You have to confront Esau's, right, here in Los Angeles, you're living in Esau's land. This is where Esau lives, because that's Hollywood. Hollywood is literally the incarnation of this today. But you have to know how to use this. And when you add it to Yaakov, then you get Yisrael. And this is the style that Rumi used, is the style that Rav Shtanzels used all the time. And that's how you really are able to make an impact on the world. You can't do it without it. You have to get these small vessels also. Okay, so that's it for now. It's getting late and long. We could continue a few more hours with all the different... I wanted to talk about King Solomon and Sheba, but some other time. Some other time.
So one question. Are the Psalms written...
Oh, it's a beautiful example. I was going to talk about that. Because what does David say about himself? He says, I am prayer. Prayer has the same gematria as poetry. Mm-hmm. That's why Psalms are all poetry. Mm-hmm. Prayer, as a connection to God, has to be poetic. I mean, because we're not poets, most of us aren't. So we take what he already wrote, and we try to instill it with what, of course you have to understand it, most people, including me, don't understand what he's saying. But that's exactly what it is. And David is considered to be the incarnation of Esau that's rectified. It says Esau was reddish, and David was reddish but with beautiful eyes. It says exactly the same language. Admoni, he's reddish, that was how Esau was, And David is Admoni ve'yefei einayim, and beautiful eyes. You have to. That's why Psalms are so popular now, I think. One of the reasons.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to cite a Rumi poem, which is in Farsi, which speaks exactly to what you were saying. You were saying that Rumi was saying that there is a river that flows from within you. The knowledge, there are two kinds of knowledge. The knowledge from that you learn and you get a card and you get your, and then there is a knowledge that flows from within you.
Mm-hmm.
Rumi has in Farsi, what you said, the poem, I'm going to cite two verses of it. It says, ای قوم به حج رفته کجایید. حج knowledge outside. معشوق همین جاست بیایید بیایید. کجا میرید دنبال خدا و معشوق؟ اینجاست. Beautiful. I know you understood that. That's beautiful.
No, you should translate.
Same thing he said.
Yeah.
You guys who are trying to go to the outside world to learn about this, to learn about that, where are you going? Come, the knowledge is right here, he says.
The divine. Because the Hajj in this case is where the Muslims go.
Pilgrimage. Yeah.
Right. And one thing that's really amazing is to, when you said to include all the smaller lights, the little lights,
Small vessels.
small vessels. I'm asking this question. I wonder if that is related to the concept of becoming selfless. The more you take the small vessels in, the more you have to be selfless to come to that place of being able to take him in. Because one of the qualities of Rumi is his selflessness.
But is it selfless or selfish in the small vessels?
So originally by Esau these were selfish vessels because you think about the entertainment industry. Initially the reason that they use this is because it sells. Because that's exactly how you get to the masses. But this too can serve the holiness.
Yes.
You have to learn how to take that selfishness and turn it into selflessness.
You know something I've noticed, I don't know how many people have read Rumi or are familiar with Persian poetry. Most of us grew up in Iran where in the space of these poems. And one of the things that you said, which is really incredible for me, and I appreciate that because it acknowledges something that I've experienced, is that the way these poems are written actually resonates in a way that straight talk doesn't resonate. It's almost like our concept that if you want to teach Torah to somebody, put it in their mouth with a little bit of a sweetness. Right? These poems do that.
Right. He's one of the best examples. I when I was reading again, I tried to think, who do I know that is like this? And really the only person I could think of was Rosh Hashanah. Again, it's not even poetry. I don't know if any...
The way he expresses it is
his expression is...
Yeah, exactly.
So it's interesting because he actually did it both ways. He wrote Masnavi.
Right.
He wrote one book which he's just teaching about people's life and evil intentions.
Stories.
The women running and then he's got his Divan Shams, the one he wrote about what he was emanating from within, which he called Shams, which is exactly the other one.
I have to say, I read a bit of Rumi, and I've read the translations, which those do not do justice. I just had an epiphany. We really have somebody more like you to be able to really capture the essence of this beauty beyond explanation. And it's really mind-boggling because many of these translators, they're amazing. They're fluent in Farsi. They have read, they read Hafiz, they've read everything, but they are not able to capture it. And I just had an epiphany. The only way, I truly believe, and I have my own thoughts about who Shams was, don't ask me about that, but the only way that we truly can capture the essence of Rumi and Shams is to be able to capture it through the eyes and the background of a chassid, of someone who's really have read the whole Mishnah, understands Tanya, and then, you know, those being written about 2,000 years ago, and then 1,200 years after that, you get this guy who is just amazing with words, and is able to capture things in a different way. And in order to be able to really emanate that to other people, you have to have that background. No translation can do justice to it unless you have that background of Mishnah, of the Talmudic background. Otherwise, it's not explainable.
That's what's missing, you're saying.
That's what's
in
missing.
many of these
It's not
translations,
explainable.
because they were
Well, I wonder, and I'm asking you this question. I've heard, I don't know where I heard, that Rumi actually has been influenced by the songs.
I imagine he was. Why wouldn't he be?
Right, it may be.
I looked in. I read the biggest biography of him, and it didn't mention that as one of them. But
In which was there any reference to the fact that a third of people who showed up at his
as Levaya, yeah, who were Jews.
yeah.
That's what they say. I mean, was Konya really a third Jewish?
I think at that particular moment in time, there was tremendous amount of, there was a robust exchange between the Muslim and the Jewish people.
You know, you have to realize what was happening. 1,200 years ago, Mongols were attacking the entire northern area. They were decimating everything. One of the reasons that Rumi and his dad fled were because they wanted to go to Konya and wanted to stay away from these barbaric people. And for that reason, many Jews had to leave. They found this safe haven. And they had a rough time during those times.
There's actually a poem that he writes about Al-Aqsa. I don't know, have you read this one?
Not in English, maybe in Farsi. You have to read.
So I thought that this was, if somehow this could be taught to. He wasn't Shiite. He was Sunni. See if I can find it. Yeah.
While you listen, you know, one of the things that he says, I am not me and you are not you. That's the whole poem. Manam manam nato tori. It's Pir manam jawan manam tiz manam kamon manam, and then he goes on and say, I'm not me, you are not you. You cannot be. And then he combines all these things that both of us feeling we could reach a higher being, which is amazing. But that's what he said. Yeah, that was what he was alluding about.
So I thought this, if if they had any mystical side to them, if the Arabs would hear this would go a long way to helping. It's called the Far Mosque, Al-Aqsa. The place that Solomon made to worship in, called the Far Mosque, is not built of earth and water and stone, but of intention and wisdom and mystical conversation and compassionate action. Every part of its intelligence and responsive to every other. The carpet bows to the broom, the door knocker and the door swing together like musicians. This heart sanctuary does exist, but it can't be described. Why try? Solomon goes there every morning and gives guidance with words, with musical harmonies, and in actions which are the deepest teaching. A prince is just a conceit until he does something with his generosity. So, So this was one of the positive contributions that he could have to Islam today.
One more question. So, going back to Psalms, one of the aspects of reading Rumi is, especially when you're reading the poetry, not the Masnavi, not the book of prose, but is that as I go through, and other people that we've studied with go through, for example, just one of his poems, there is a change in our internal vibration where we become lighter. My question is, when you read Psalms in Hebrew, does it have the same impact?
So,
I can tell you that when I read the Psalms in English, that has
but
impact.
I want to hear it. I want to get, because I don't read Hebrew, and I can't because in one word there is a context of 1,000 years of connection. I'm sure in Psalms.
the big difference for me between all the Rumi that I've read and Psalms is, first of all, yes, it changes your inner vibe.
Right.
But with Psalms, it feels like every single sentence, even word sometimes, is all facing God all the time. It's not like here he's facing the world.
Right.
But King David is constantly facing God. There's a gematria that we like. It says that King David was dancing before God. Lifnei Hashem.
Yeah.
Lifnei Hashem is equal to 14 squared. 14 is the value of David. It's like that he's always before Hashem. He's like, his consciousness is that there's nothing except for Hashem in front of me. That's why he's not like Rumi, because he's not trying to unravel the physical world. For him, the physical world is Hashem. Everything is Hashem. It's just he's always in front of Hashem. That's the feeling that I get from Tehillim.
That's very interesting you say that. I just remember there's a Rumi poem that he actually says, "I only am here because you want me to be here," right? So he still has that distinction of there and here, while King David is always just, okay, if this is happening, this is God happening. If this is happening, it's God happening. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, he's one track mind.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. You should do it the same.